The White Scars. Masters of the lightning strike and hit and run tactics, brave, fierce, and unstoppable. They form the 5th Legion, and are the subject of this, my 4th Horus Heresy kitbashing video. I began this kitbash by removing the parts required to build a Mark 6 Space Marine torso and legs. Once clipped from their sprue, the parts were cleaned up of their mold lines and sprue tabs. The first modification that I made wasn't one specific to the White Scars, and is instead just an easy way to add a little variation to your Mark 6 units. By angling one of the lower legs slightly outwards and trimming back the knee joint, I was able to change the position of the model. Cutting away some of the joint behind the left knee caused the model to lean forward slightly and lift the right leg up, giving the model the appearance of being in the middle of a movement. The White Scars, especially those from around the time of the Horus Heresy, are often depicted with armour and weapons that are based on East Asian societies of the 2nd millennium. Similarly, the Iron Golem's warband from Warcry also seems to have taken inspiration from this time period and wields weapons similar to the Japanese kanabo. In order to graft this spiked club to a Space Marine, I first cut away the blade and crossguard from a Mark 6 sword, before removing the mace from its hand. Once removed, these cuts were then shaved flat. Due to the small contact points between these two components, I decided to use a pin to help hold things more securely in place. To achieve this, I first drilled a 1mm wide hole into both the mace and the sword handle. Some steel florist wire was superglued into the mace and then clipped down so just a small amount of wire was left protruding. This wire was then glued into the hole in the sword, completing the bond. From here, the right arm and hand could be attached to the torso. For the left arm, I wanted to demonstrate the White Scar's fearful combat abilities and have the Marine holding up a trophy of his most recent kill. The Grey Knight's kit comes with a hand gripping the severed head of a demonette, and, handily, it works perfectly well with the Mark 6 kit. No additional cutting or trimming was required here. The arm was simply glued to the torso, followed by the Grey Knight hand. For the shoulder pads, rather than attaching the stock, one smooth, one bumpy style of Mark 6 pads, I instead went for 2 smooth shoulder pads instead. This is subtle, but for legions like the White Scars and even the Raven Guard, a less bulky and more lithe profile helps to complement and allude to that agile nature. My next task was to add some more decorative details to this White Scar. Heresy era scars feature these small metal discs that can also be found in the Iron Golem's kit, particularly this standard. From this component, part of the hanging discs were cut away and compared to the left shoulder pad. After a few small clips and trims to help the discs to fit better, they were glued into place beneath the pad. Continuing with the decorative details, I thought it was time to utter the immortal words, "Dead Animal Bits," and attach a few skull trophies to the waist. These skulls were sourced from the ever-useful Citadel Skulls kit, but required the rear halves of the skull to be removed and rounded out first. This just allowed the skull to better sit against the belt when it came to glue it. I finished off the decorations with some flowing parchment from the Black Templar upgrade kit. This might seem like an odd choice for the White Scars, but these long strips of parchment give you the perfect surface in which to add vertical lines of Chagorian script. After a little trim, the paper was glued to the belt, followed by a pistol holster. The final modification to this model was the head, and the component I settled on for this was a Primus Reaver head that just had the skull mask rather than the full helmet. While the head alone would have worked well, I wanted to create something similar in style to Chinzar's Oni like helmet. To do this, I cut up and mixed a small amount of green stuff. From this mix, a very small and very thin sausage was rolled out before being carefully cut in half. These halves would form tusks that were gently placed on either side of the mask. As usual, a little Vaseline was used here to prevent my fingers and tools from sticking to the putty. After being allowed to cure overnight, I was left with this, which meant that all I needed to do now was to glue the model to the base before supergluing a small chunk of cork floor tile onto it as well. Finally, I used the same pinning steps as earlier in order to keep the head and backpack separate, which would make these components easier to hold while I painted them separately from the main body. And with that, I was ready to paint. But first, let's hear about the sponsors of this video, Demeo. As a tabletop gamer, I'm always looking for new ways to immerse myself in my favourite games, and Demeo is the perfect solution. It's a dungeon crawler that puts you right in the action, with stunning graphics and intuitive gameplay. Plus, it's available in VR and allows you to exist as a pair of disembodied hands, just like me. The best part is that Demeo is designed specifically for tabletop gamers. It's got all the elements we love: dice rolling, grid-based movement, and strategic combat, but in a fully realized 3D environment. You can tackle the dungeon solo or party up and play with your friends online, but that's not all. You can also hang out with your buddies and paint your models all in VR. Since playing Demeo, I can't get enough. It's the perfect complement to my tabletop gaming sessions, and it's even given me a few ideas for new things I can do with my own miniatures. If you're a fan of tabletop games, which if you're watching this video you probably are, then you owe it to yourself to check out Demeo. It's available on PC, VR, and has recently been released on PS5 and PSVR 2. So whether your gaming preference is the PC, the couch, or virtual reality, Demeo has you covered. You can find out more about the game and pick it up for yourself by checking out my link down in the comments and description below. A big thank you for Demeo for sponsoring this video. The painting process was started with a black primer, specifically some of Vallejo's black surface primer, which was applied through an airbrush. This created a better surface in which to paint on, whilst also giving me some dark shadows that I would retain in the deeper recesses. The White Scar's armour is, unsurprisingly, white, but rather than going straight to it, I chose to begin the painting by mixing together some Tamiya XF20 medium grey along with some Tamiya thinner in my airbrush. This thin mixture was then sprayed from a higher angle, so it only fell onto the upper surfaces and left the downwards facing surfaces as their original black. This resulted in the appearance of shadows in areas you would expect them to form when the light is coming from above. The medium grey had given the models a warmer tan tone, which would help to serve as a mid-tone between the black of the shadows and the Tamiya XF2 white that I applied next. Again, this was mixed into some thinners and applied through my airbrush, which also helped to create a smooth consistency and finish. Like before, my application came from above the model. I mainly focused on the most prominent points, which resulted in the formation of a gradient from black to the light tan and then to white, helping to create more depth in the armor's tone. By using a thin mixture, I could make several passes, with each one subtly building up the intensity of the white on areas that I wanted to draw the most attention to, resulting in smoother transitions and a smoother texture. With the white in place, the other iconic White Scar colour was the red. For this, I turned to the Sanguine Scarlet from the Tooth and Coats range of paints, which I'll be continuing to use in the rest of this video. However, I wanted my White Scar's red to lean slightly more towards the magenta side, so, as well as a little thinner to allow the paint to flow through my airbrush, I mixed in a little of Citadel's Doomfire Magenta contrast paint into my Sanguine Scarlet. The resultant mix was sprayed across the whole of the power pack and the head, again using several thin layers in order to achieve a smooth and even colour. Now, while I've used an airbrush for these last few steps, it's not really a requirement. If you don't have an airbrush, feel free to just dry brush or rattle can some white over the black primer and manually paint the red with a regular brush instead. You'll still be able to follow the rest of the steps with no problems. For the rest of the painting process, I'll be tackling each area individually, applying a base coat first, followed by a combination of layers or highlights. The first of these areas were the steel details. For these areas, I mixed up a combination of Death Reaper and Surcoat Silver, which resulted in this darker silver colour. After adding a little water to the mix to make it easier to apply, this mixture was then painted across the various silver metal details, such as the weapons, vents, and details on the helmet. The trick here is to apply a couple of thin coats to give you the best coverage, whilst trying to be as neat as possible. In order to bring out the details in the metallic areas, I began the first of 2 highlights by applying some of the brighter silver of plate armour across the edges. Lightening these points helps to contrast them against the darker base colour, helping to lift them up from the surface. The final step was an extreme highlight of Mythril Blade. Rather than lining all of the edges with this paint, I focused predominantly on the corners where 2 edges converged. This helped to create the appearance of sharpness, further enhancing those details. For the gold details, like those around the hilt and the discs, I simply repeated the same steps as before, but with different paints. I began the process with Spartan Bronze. The details were then highlighted with some Dragon's Gold, before applying a final extreme highlight of Glistening Gold. After completing this step, my metallics were complete, so I refreshed my paint water to prevent cross-contamination of metal flakes into my other paints. The next areas to tackle were the black details, such as the pipes and joints in the armour. Normally, I would paint these black and highlight with a grey or a grey-blue paint. However, due to the lighter colour of the white armour around it, something as dark as black wasn't necessary to get that contrast, so I opted to use the dark grey of Cold Corpse Blue instead. These areas were then highlighted with Wolf Grey along their edges, before adding smaller dots of Gravestone Blue to just a few places where you'd expect more light to fall on. To paint the brown leather of the belt and the pistol's holster, I began with a base coat of Scorched Earth. To bring out the details in the leather areas, I first applied my highlight of Ancient Forest. However, when I came to the second highlight, I used more of a ragged motion. By adding perpendicular lines emanating from the edges, I gave the leather a worn and creased appearance. My next area of focus were the skulls, and to create that bone coloration, I began with a base coat of Dragon Fang. But rather than going straight into a highlight for the next step, I instead applied a layer of Skeleton Legion. Like with the base coat, I thinned my paint with a little water and painted over the skulls, leaving the darker Dragon Fang still visible within the recesses. This technique is particularly useful for areas like the skulls that lack those more defined edges. For the final step though, I did return to the highlights in order to pick out the edges with some Vampire Fang. To paint the flesh on the severed demonette's head, I began with a base coat of Runic Purple. But for my layer, I created a mixture of Runic Purple and Trooper White, mixing together 2 parts purple to 1 part white before applying the paint in a similar way to how I approached the skulls. For the highlight, more Trooper White was added to my previous mix and applied as an edge highlight across the skin. For the exposed skin of the White Scar, some Barbarian Brawn was first applied as a base coat, followed by an initial layer of Dwarven Skin, and then a highlight of Elven Skin. Finally, a very small amount of thinned Ivory Tusk was then used as an extreme highlight over only the most prominent facial details. I could next turn my attention to the red areas of the model, but rather than jumping straight into the highlights, I first decided to add some markings to the White Scar's right leg. The earlier Sanguine Scarlet and Doomfire Magenta mix was recreated and thinned out to allow me to mark out some jagged patterns across the lower leg. After marking out the edges, the colour of the shapes was then blocked in. To lighten my original mix, some Vampire Fang was added, and this slightly paler pinkish red was used to highlight the edges of the red areas. Once again, I used a slightly more ragged and scratchy approach, helping to give the armour a slightly worn and textured look. More Vampire Fang was added to the mix to create the extreme highlight that was focused onto only the corners and more prominent edges. As the earlier airbrushing had already created the basic colour of the armour, I could jump straight into highlighting. I began with Carcharadon Grey. By not going for a pure white earlier, highlights could still be added, resulting in a less flat looking white surface. In addition, this paint was also used to base coat the tusks on the masks. This was followed up with a second highlight of White Star, which saw me adding scratches and damage to both the edges and the surfaces of the armour. Finally, this was used as a highlight on the edges of the tusks. With all the colours in place, there were just a few more steps to help add a little extra detail to the model. But before these could be done, all the components were given an all-over gloss varnish. This smooth gloss finish would create a much better surface in which to apply decals to. I saw some decals from a 40k kit, but probably would have preferred some 30cal decals instead. Still, these were cut out and left to soak in some water until the transfers were lifting from the backing paper. From here, the decals were carefully applied to the shoulder pads and then left to dry. But to create that painted on look, I would need to use some Microsol. This mild solvent can be painted onto decals where it will soften them and allow them to conform to the surface beneath. You might need to do this a couple of times to get the best effect, but just allow the Microsol to fully dry between applications. To help seal in the decals, another layer of gloss varnish was applied over the top of them. While I had achieved a good amount of shading from the earlier airbrushing and highlights, there were still a number of recesses that weren't quite as dark as they should have been. This would be resolved with an oil wash. I created this from black oil paint. This paint was squeezed onto some cardboard to help absorb the excess oil and then steadily mixed into some odorless thinners until I had achieved a wash-like consistency. You can buy pre-made washes, but it's fairly cheap and easy to make your own. Just make sure that you use a synthetic brush for this, as you can cause damage to your bristles. This wash was then applied to the entirety of the model. The low viscosity of the wash, combined with the smooth gloss surface, allowed the oil to flow into the recessed areas through capillary action. Once dry, the wash would create the appearance of shadows, helping to emphasize the details in the surfaces. The reason I chose an oil wash over a regular acrylic one is that they can be easily adjusted. By using a clean brush dampened with thinners, you can easily adjust and remove oils from surfaces where you didn't want them to form. With the model itself completed, the surface of the base needed a little colour and texture added to it. I settled on a sulphur desert surface, and to create this, I used some of AK Interactive's Sunrise Blaze texture paste. This was layered across the entire base in a couple of layers, making sure that great care was taken to not overspill onto the model itself. To bring out the texture in the base, the gritty surface was dry brushed first with Vampire Fang, followed by the lighter Ivory Tusk, both of which helped to lighten and improve the depth of the texture. With the dry brush completed, the rim of the base was cleaned up with a little Doom Death Black. To give the impression of dust building up in the recesses of the White Scar's lower legs, I took some dark sun yellow and heavily thinned it out with water to create a wash-like consistency. This wash was applied directly into the recesses of the feet and lower legs. Once dry, it would simulate the appearance of accumulated dust and debris. All that was left to do now was to remove the metal holders, shave the paint from the contact points, and glue the head and backpack to the torso. Everything was given a quick coat of matte varnish to tone down the gloss varnish a little, and with that, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Heresy era White Scar. As with my previous Horus Heresy builds, while I made a few changes to a single model in this video, these don't all need to be applied to every single one of your miniatures. They can instead be spread out across a whole army. By just focusing these details onto a few select models within your units, you can give your army a huge amount of theming beyond just a different paint scheme. Now, this is the fourth guide of the series, where I've been tackling each of the legions in order. So if you haven't done so already, check out my previous Dark Angels, Emperor's Children, and Iron Warrior guides, and expect to see a similar video for the Space Wolves next. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Jonathan Sandsteed, Kasper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. And my Sergeant level channel members, who are Whale Tussler and Philip Poyer. If you're interested in supporting me, you can hit the join button below or find a link to my Patreon in the description. Supporters get a whole host of benefits, including ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, I also have a few t-shirts and mugs up for sale, featuring designs drawn by me. You can check those out by following the links below or by going over to petethewargamer.com. So, until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.